Great. Well, it's very nice to see everyone. Welcome to the first ACM workshop on programming for the planet. As you may, I don't know if you know us, I'm Dominic Orchard.
I'm Anil Madhav.
And Anil and I have been, we're from this community, but we've been thinking about how our community can assist in addressing various of the global crises and challenges that we're facing today. So we thought, let's put together a workshop where we can bring people from the PROPL community to think about how we can contribute and how we can help in some of these issues. So we kind of put out this call, and then we were really super happy to get talks that really fall into a bunch of different categories which think about this problem from different angles. And there are lots of different ways of thinking about this, and I think we have really good representation of that today. So we're going to have talks that we roughly grouped into these four categories. Thinking about, well, we've got the keynotes first, and that's going to give us a bit of context about some of the challenges and some potential ways forward. Then the rest of the day, we've got talks that look at modeling and analysis, so climate modeling and data analysis. They are programming challenges, right? So we know lots about programming here, so there's a role for us there. Thinking about energy and efficiency of our computer systems. They use a lot of resources. How can we address that? Software engineering and ecosystems, again, that's about all of the things that go around writing software that contributes in some way to addressing the problem, and it's really a cross-cutting thing. And then lastly, where the impact, where the rubber hits the road, influencing policy and decision making. So we don't want to say too much more, but maybe Anil, you can say a bit about the kind of structure when we get into the more discussion side of things.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
So there'll be plenty of time during the day to have discussions. The other thing we really want to do is to have an action-oriented workshop. So we want to figure out what we can do in order to do our part to build up a bigger picture set of actions and outcomes towards working on climate change and biodiversity. So towards the end of the day, we're going to start doing some brainstorming. So try to take notes, try to form ideas about things you'd like to do as well, and we can put all those together at the end. But now, with no further ado, I'm delighted to welcome our first keynote speaker. We have two keynotes this morning, and this is Drew Purves, who will introduce himself, but he's been a champion for climate and biodiversity in a number of technology companies over the years, and he's going to give us a view on where he thinks we should go next and what the current challenges are. So, Drew, please, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me okay. And yeah, so thanks very much for the invite, Anil, and everyone else that would have approved that as well. It's a real privilege to be here. Yeah, it's really, really interesting. And I think what you're trying to achieve here is fantastic. So yeah, hopefully what we're about to say will make some sense. So as you mentioned, the keynote is going to be quite broad, sort of set the overall context around biodiversity. And then we've got another keynote focused on climate, which is great. So I suppose without further ado, I'll get started. So firstly, I should probably say a little bit about me. So I had about 18 years in ecology and environmental data science. That's a picture of me doing my PhD in York many, many years ago, like growing plants and things. From there, I went to Princeton, did a postdoc for a long time, got integrated there into what we would now call machine learning and data science. And also learned a bit about things like climate modeling, Earth system models, things like that. Went on to Microsoft Research Cambridge, we carried on that style of work, had quite a healthy sized research group there for about 8 years or so. It was sort of extending that general approach, so trying to kind of understand and predict natural systems through various forms of data science. So that was a real privilege to be there as well. Then I shifted gears, and in 2015 joined DeepMind and actually went right down into sort of fundamentals of AI research, mostly looking at what we call embodied RL, sort of training agents to do things like this in virtual worlds. But then more recently in Google DeepMind, we've started up, I'm going to see if I can get to the next slide, sorry. We started up a sustainability program. So it's only a few months ago we formally established this program. So it has so a number of us have come together and are co-leading the program together, and we've got a number of active projects. We have 3 different areas. Of course, we're looking at climate, so we have energy and decarbonisation as well as weather and climate modelling. And there's a third area, which is biodiversity and ecology, and that's the area that I have a particular interest in. So I wanted to mention that. And of course, given that we're coming in from Google DeepMind. And by the way, this should say, what can AI do for biodiversity? I'm sorry, I missed it. I mean, it is true. I am asking this question, what I can do for biodiversity. But what I meant to say was what AI could do for biodiversity. Because, of course, that's our thing, AI, from the Google DeepMind angle, and by which we really mean scaled up deep learning. On the other hand, the program does cut across the rest of Google, so we're collaborating with other areas, so we can also think about what we could do with hardware and compute and all the rest. As we know, these problems are actually, are actually very multifaceted, aren't they? So I wanted to mention my background a bit, just so you know where I'm coming from, but also to give you some caveats. So actually, this is quite a recent shift for me back into the world of biodiversity. Quite a lot's changed. It's a very rapidly changing landscape. All good, but it is changing quite quickly. So I'm going to just give you my understanding of where we are now, which is changing monthly as the landscape changes. And also just to underline that I'm very much not an expert on programming languages. So Anil and I spoke about this. Anil assured me that if I gave the background around biodiversity and the challenges and so on, then actually that will help to form the discussions you're going to have about the programming language side of things. I mean, I have used programming languages and so on, but I've just never written any. So let's right back to basics then. So what is biodiversity? And there is actually quite a tight definition of this, and it's around the variety of living organisms. What I like to imagine is you go somewhere, like into your garden or somewhere similar, and you gather up everything, every organism, from the very tiniest bacteria up to the trees and the birds and so on, and you gather them all in your arms, and you have a look at that collection of organisms. And biodiversity is about how diverse, what's the variety of measurable traits of those organisms. If you want to look at that a little bit more mathematically, you could think about traits and plotting the individual. So if each of those little dots there is an individual in your collection, the traits could be things like body mass, or if it was a bird, it could be diet, or if it's a plant, it could be something like leaf thickness. If it's a tree, it could be wood density and so on. And biodiversity is about the variance in that cloud. So that means it's not actually about, say, the amount of nature, it's not the volume, etc. It's really about that variety. Having said that, of course, it's easy to imagine doing that. It's extremely difficult to actually gather all the organisms in your arms and measure them all. So what we do is we use proxies, and one of the most common is species richness. So you would take a collection of organisms. Typically, it wouldn't be all of them. It might be within a certain group, like the trees or the birds, and you would say how many species are represented. Alternatively, we might actually look for indicator species. There's certain individual species, the presence of which we think indicates an otherwise healthy or diverse ecosystem. We might focus on particular threatened species. We might look at things like habitat cover, of course, as well. So actually the word biodiversity can sometimes grade into a broader sense of just nature as well. So you should be aware of that. So and this is something, I think the language is still evolving a bit around this. So we sort of shift between biodiversity and nature. But nonetheless, I think it's helpful to go back to that fundamental definition of biodiversity. Perhaps a more interesting question is, where is biodiversity? And one of the things that really amazes me is we actually know quite a lot about this. So we can very casually now have a look at these global maps, for example. And on the left, that's the distribution of terrestrial animal species richness. So you can quite clearly see that we have these hotspots in places like the Amazon. They actually, that animal richness and plant richness correlates actually very well with something called NPP, which is the net rate at which ecosystems are fixing carbon. And actually that's one of the intellectual questions around ecology. Why is it actually that NPP and species richness are so closely correlated on land for plants and animals and so on? On the other hand, marine species show a quite different distribution of diversity, and there's some association there with productivity, but actually there is some patterns that really illustrate that we need to think about things like ocean currents and the connectivity between places. So we see very high biodiversity, for example, in Southeast Asia, which has lots of islands, and so it's something to do with the way that the islands are breaking up the ecosystem. So it's not as simple as just productivity. On the bottom right there, though, it's also interesting, going back to that definition of biodiversity about the actual traits and the variety of the organisms, these things don't always line up. So there we have different traits, and SLA is leaf thickness, and so we actually see the greatest variety of leaf thickness at actually high temperate latitudes, whereas we see the greatest variety of plant height and seed mass density in the tropics, and so traits and species don't always travel together. And one of the things that amazes me about this is not just that this is interesting, but that we know this stuff, right? I mean, just imagine the millions of hours of human effort that have gone into creating these maps that we can so casually look at, all the from the kind of 17th century botany onwards to get us to where we are now, which is really incredible. On the other hand, of course, biodiversity is under threat. Most of you probably would have seen this planetary boundaries framework that tries to sort of give a somewhat low-dimensional view of global environmental challenges. And one of the interesting things there is that one of the two real standout kind of worrying areas is biodiversity, the one on the top left there. The other one being pollution. So it's kind of interesting that according to this, climate change is not as bad. In fact, it's nowhere near as bad as biodiversity and pollution. That's not in any way to say that climate change isn't important, because we've got very special reasons for thinking, A, that climate change is going to increase exponentially unless we do something about it. So we're worried about the direction of travel. And B, of course, climate change has a very direct influence on everything else. So that's not in any way to reduce the importance of climate, but nonetheless, we can see why we might also be concerned about biodiversity. So when we try to do a somewhat objective assessment, it very much lights up as a very worrying area. So, and of course, biodiversity loss threatens everything else. And this is very, very recent. Just a few days ago, the World Economic Forum released their Global Risk Report 2024. Very interesting. If we look over the 10-year time horizon on the right, that actually biodiversity loss, they rank as the third greatest global risk among all categories of risk. That includes things like AI safety, one that gets a lot of headlines, but also things like armed conflict and so on. So they're actually putting it right up there. It's also interesting to see that the top 4 risks are all environmental. So the top one being extreme weather, so that points back to climate change. Again, I don't know why I'm laughing. I mean, it's obviously worrying. But anyway, this is just more evidence, really, that biodiversity is very important. And also related to that, biodiversity has very strong links with other environmental challenges, of course. So one particularly tangible example of that is to think about the relationship between biodiversity, between carbon storage and deforestation in ecosystems and farming. And they're all very closely tied together. So the greatest single threat to biodiversity globally is tropical deforestation. That's also a major source of net human carbon emissions, of course, and is driven by agriculture, mostly in commodities and so on. So these things are very tightly coupled together. And actually, increasingly now, we realize we need to be thinking about climate. Now, often it's nature, but climate, nature, and people together as well. So it's not only the right thing to do to think about the indigenous communities, especially in those places who actually need their livelihoods and a farming for a good reason, but also if you don't actively engage with those communities, you actually won't achieve your carbon or your biodiversity goals. And there was a very interesting statement that came out of COP'28 all about that. So COP'28 is explicitly a climate-focused conference, and yet they made a joint statement around climate and nature and people together. Similarly, COP'15, the most recent biodiversity-focused conference, talked a lot about climate. So these things are intimately tied together as well. So what's the world doing about it? And the exciting thing is the world kind of is swinging into action around biodiversity. And I think a very simple view of that, I mean, there's a lot that's going on, and of course there has been a lot of conservation action from NGOs and governmental concern and action around biodiversity for a long time. But some of the things that I think would be worth everyone here knowing about are these ones here. So if we look at governments, there's this new framework called 30 by 30, it goes under 30 by 30. And this is a global target to protect 30% of the planet for nature by 2030. I put NGOs and charities just to point out what an important sector they are in terms of conservation, but they actually have quite a wide variety of frameworks that they would work within. In the space of enterprise, private, and then we can break that down, say, into manufacturing on the one hand. An example of there is the EUDR regulation recently, which actually requires all goods imported into the EU to be demonstrably free of deforestation right down the supply chain. Extremely difficult thing to do. And then if we look at the special sector of the financial sector, then there's the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Based Financial Disclosures, TNFD. And this is a new framework for businesses to report and manage nature-related risks and impacts. So these are all kind of global, important policy mechanisms that these major sectors are going to work within. The other amazing thing about them is that they've all appeared within the last 2 years. So it's kind of incredible to think that these major things that we're just now casually talking about, and Neil, and others here will be aware of these frameworks, but actually it's easy to forget that none of these were here 2 years ago. They were just ideas. So this, on the other hand, these frameworks, these actors and sectors, governments and companies, to then work within these frameworks need lots of information. And here's one example of that. So this is the official name of 30 by 30 is this, the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework Target 3. But anyway, that's why we call it 30 by 30. So here's the long version of it. And what I've done in here is I've highlighted in bold the various detailed bits of information, because of course you could protect 30%, it's kind of simple, but it's not just any 30%. In fact, it's 30% that has to be, it's 30% of terrestrial and inland water areas, areas of particular importance for biodiversity and ecosystem function, effectively conserved and managed, ecologically representative, well connected, equitably governed, recognizing indigenous territories, and so on. There's a whole load of information here. And the TLDR on this, in a way, is shitloads of GIS, is one way to think about it, right? Like, to actually define the correct 30% in a demonstrable way is a huge challenge in kind of geographic and biodiversity information. Oh, go ahead. Oh, sorry, geographic information systems. Probably a bit of an old-fashioned term, actually, nowadays. But yeah, so you can think of a whole load of sort of geographic data analysis and so on that would be needed to demonstrably do a good job of 30 by 30. And that's just one example of many. So the question is, I suppose, who will provide this information? And we don't quite know yet. I think we'll actually see a growing set of NGOs and companies and so on will swing into action. But the good thing is there is actually quite a large existing ecosystem and biodiversity information providers. And it's obviously going to be a lot of this information initially certainly will come from this ecosystem, which we hope will grow and become more and more efficient. I'm going to come back to that before the end. So here's one example of that. So a whole bunch of different organizations, a surprising number of them actually under the Cambridge Conservation Initiative, who are doing lots of this data analysis to then form data products. There's one called a big one called IBAT, which then goes on downstream to other specialist providers and so on, which eventually makes it through into governments and private companies and so on. So this is all happening already, which is fantastic news. On the other hand, there are challenges. So if we look at the biodiversity information that's coming out today, it tends to be incomplete. So that's incomplete geographically. So most of the information layers that you would look at will have major geographic gaps. Taxonomically, so it may cover certain species or certain taxa, but completely miss others. One example is there's a thing called the key biodiversity areas. This is a major, effectively the official definition of biodiversity hotspots around the world. And that's at the moment just based on birds and mammals, I think. So it doesn't include plants. I believe that's the case. So that's one example of a taxonomic gap. It tends to be very coarse, spatial scale, coarse in scale. One example of that is the IUCN, which is the official authority on species ranges, they produce these binary maps, essentially like 1 and 0, which is where we think the species is and where we think it isn't. And they recommend a 50-kilometer buffer around the edge of these on these maps. And for a lot of decision making, that's just too coarse. They also have unknown uncertainty. Of course, there'll always be uncertainty in information and predictions like this. I think perhaps the biggest problem, though, is that the degree of uncertainty is actually unknown. So we know it's uncertain, but we don't know how uncertain. And that makes it very difficult then to incorporate the notions of uncertainty into downstream decision making. The data is refreshed quite slowly at the moment. So some of the species ranges, for example, might only reappear every 10 years or so. Lacking forecast in general. So we're typically looking at what's there now or what's been happening recently. A lot of decision making would like to know what's coming into the future, especially when we think about things like the impact of climate change on species. So every species that we know and almost every measure of biodiversity is changing, is not static. And so therefore, when we're making decisions, we need to be thinking about the future, and that's largely missing. Unstable, I put this in because of you, Anil. I didn't really think about this, but this is particularly the reference that you were saying about how you can sometimes hit the same APIs and hit the same data sets and actually get different answers. So there's a kind of instability in the software systems and things like versioning of data and so on. So various challenges. But of course, on the other hand, these challenges turn into a host of opportunities for AI, which is the part that I'm trying to look at, of course, but in every other way, things like hardware, software and platforms, socio-technical solutions. I'll come to that a bit, but it's very important to think of all our solutions connected to people. And of course, last but not least, programming languages. Okay, so there'll be all sorts of opportunities to think about these challenges on the left and what you could do in terms of programming languages and platforms on the right. So shifting gear a little bit now then, the bit that we've been thinking about most is this idea of how could AI, let me see if I can get that to refresh. How could AI help to address some of these challenges in biodiversity information. I'm seeing a different thing on here and here. I'm not sure why, but I think it might be. Sorry.
That's right. You just keep going.
Okay, I'll keep going. So broadly speaking, we're breaking that. We've actually been using a very simple framework to help us think through that, which is to think of data, models, and decisions. That's not a particularly new framework, but one of the reasons we wanted to use that was because there was a tendency for AI to instantly default to the data aspect, which I'll go through in a second. So what we can imagine then is we can use AI to assist in collecting ecological data in the first place. So that's things like observations of plants and animals in different places. Then separately to that, we could use AI to integrate the data that we do have together into downstream information and predictions. So you could think of the first of those being a bit like putting more weather stations out, sort of weather stations for ecology. The middle part's like weather modeling, to say, okay, given the weather station data, we actually need to make the weather predictions. So that means filling things in space, so we're densifying the observations, but also forecasting into the future. And then last but not least, an easy one to forget is there's a lot of potential for applying AI and other technologies at the decision-making stage. And the way I think about that is, if we get the first two right, so we end up collecting a lot more data, and then we integrate that data together into lots more downstream information, we're actually in danger of creating information overload for decision makers. So imagine you've suddenly got, incredibly fine-grained predictions of the future of every species on the planet. No human brain can absorb that level of information. And so the idea of this third category is actually the active deployment of AI to assist in decision making. So this, you can imagine it's something like a kind of AI assistant that can actually access all of those high-res information sources and help groups of humans, because it always is groups, to make the best decisions they can against that data and information.
Are you detecting a second screen?
Yeah, I think we're having a couple of AV issues. I'm quite happy to keep talking, by the way, while you're doing this.
Are you detecting this?
It's just come back.
No, it's not.
No?
Are you detecting a second monitor?
PhD in 1998 in ecology, and the amount of data that we now routinely have available is just completely unimaginable compared to what we had back then. So it's really, really great news, and it's for that reason actually that we can already get started on this integrated modeling part in the middle, because there is so much data available. The single largest database, for instance, includes more than 2 billion species observations now, so it's quite a lot of data. On the other hand, the data is, here we go, is very patchy. It's patchy geographically and taxonomically. Here we go. So here's a picture. And it's also fragmented across databases. So this is actually a list of databases that contain ecological data. Every single one of those is a different database. GBIF is the single largest one. And then if we look inside GBIF itself, what we find is there's a kind of long tail geographically. So there are a small number of countries that are very, very well represented, and then a much longer tail of countries with much less data. And we see the same taxonomically. So we see lots and lots of data, for instance, for birds, and then a bit less for mammals, and a bit less for plants, and very, very little for fungi and insects, and so on. So I think of it as a long tail of long tails, in the sense that we've got this long tail of databases, And then inside each database, we've got this long tail geographically and taxonomically as well. So it's a huge challenge actually in integrating this data together. And very importantly, that also overlaps with socioeconomic inequality. So there's a really interesting, very recent paper actually, just from a few days ago, that explicitly relates that geographic gappiness to socioeconomics. And so, of course, what we find is we have got a lot more data from the world's richest countries and a lot less from the world's poorest countries. That's doubly worrying because most of the biodiversity and most biodiversity change is happening in those poorer countries. So make these major data gaps. And in fact, we see sort of gaps all the way down. So even in a really well-covered country like the US, if you actually look at the data, of course, you'll find that it's suspiciously clustered around things like cities and roads. And if you were naive here, actually, you would conclude that most species love being by cities and love being by roads, that most animals love, light pollution and so on, because that's where a lot of the observations are. So we have to actually, when we think about the downstream modeling part, we have to do quite a lot to try to sort of infer the underlying reality against these biases in the data. So what can we do about that? And as I mentioned, there is a lot we can do. This is an ongoing really revolution in the sensing side. So we've got these new sensing technologies, bioacoustics, so microphones in the field, wildlife cameras, for example, and even eDNA. This is an incredible revolution where we can take bulk samples of things like water from soil and actually then identify all the species, little fragments of the species that are in there. It's quite incredible, right? So, and also these are really nicely complementary. So actually eDNA isn't very good for some groups, say birds, but of course bioacoustics is really good for birds. And so together we've got really good coverage. Now, of course, when we think about AI then, what all of these sensing technologies do is create a huge amount of raw data. So there's an obvious opportunity then for deep learning, scaled up deep learning to help make sense of that data, including classifying species. So I'll put some links in there. We'll obviously share the deck after this so you can follow that up. So it's a major area and something extremely enthusiastic about. On the other hand, it's also easy to forget that there's a huge amount of ecological data out there that's never been digitized, or if it's been digitized, is in some fragmented database that no one's really discovered yet. So I think there's actually, and I've got a bit of a zealousness of the convert around large language models, LLMs at the moment. They weren't an inherent interest of mine, but actually over the last few months, the more I've been thinking about it, the more I'm convinced that the LLMs really are actually a genuine, absolutely transformative kind of technology, sort of in the history of humans. I've been playing around a bit with them. And there's a huge opportunity here, I think, in particular for using large language models to discover, scrape, and integrate existing ecological data. Including, for example, in those, say, sub-Saharan Africa, a region with very little ecological data at the moment. But actually, all of those sub-Saharan African countries have been doing wildlife surveys and ecological surveys for decades. So the data actually is there. So not just now, but even historical data measuring change. If only we can discover it and then increasingly automate the rate that we can integrate that data back into the databases. So there's a real opportunity there that I think is very exciting. But of course, that and all of these other things are socio-technical problems. So part of the reason that data hasn't been integrated is what are the incentives for people to do that? Who is going to actually do that integration and why? Do they have the skills to do it? We also want to think about ethics, privacy, community, and more. And on the socio-technical side, when it comes to data, I wanted to point out this amazing project called iNaturalist, which really got this right within the cultural context it was working in, beginning in the US. And so what this did was a simple app where people could take a picture and then they would say what species they thought it was. But then that went into a community. It's like a kind of social networking solution in a way for ecological observations, where experts would then verify that observation. So it was a fully human thing initially. But of course, as that flywheel continued, it gathered more and more examples of labeled data, images with rigorous labels attached. On top of that, they've then been able to build the vision model. So now when you use iNaturalist, you actually get an automatic classification. That makes it a better app, so more people use it. And this has grown and grown to the point that now iNaturalist is the single largest source of ecological observations on Earth now. It's something like half of GBIF came from this app, an app on a phone, right? It's an incredible story. On the other hand, we need more work, and we probably need different approaches to make that work worldwide, because that whole process really only gets going when you already have a well-established community of sort of naturalists and experts and so on. And a lot of the world, we don't have that yet. So, but still, so that gives us a hint there. If we could do something similar for the rest of the world, outside the sort of G20, if you like, that could be equally transformative. So going on to, how am I doing for time, Anil?
20 minutes.
20, okay, that's great, thanks. So if we go on to the second category, sorry. 15. Okay, good. Thanks. So if we go to the middle category then of this idea of AI-assisted geotemporal modeling, it says, given the data that is available, we can then obviously use AI, that is, again, scaled up deep learning and other methods and technology to integrate that together into downstream information. And broadly speaking, I think there are two categories of that information that we would go for. One goes under the name, and again, this is just so you're aware of the language, sort of state of nature. So this would include, this is the bit that focuses on biodiversity itself, the variety of living organisms, but also those proxies, so the species richness, indicator species, habitat, perhaps population sizes. So this is the kind of, if you like, the stock of biodiversity, and also how it's been changing. And one thing to note there is, of course, none of these things sum in the way that carbon sums for climate. This is one of the fundamental differences between biodiversity and climate. There isn't a sort of single number, really, that you can necessarily use. But still, that's the idea that that we can integrate that data together to estimate the state of nature. And because they don't sum over space, this tends to take us into this fundamentally geographic sort of realm. So it's almost always maps in a way that we're thinking about with these. But there is an ongoing process of exploring kind of indicators and metrics, like ways to boil those maps back down to numbers that can help decision making. So instead of state of nature, think about maps like this. And this is a map actually from a recent paper from Anil and colleagues on this new life metric, which I think is really interesting, which is trying to take all of that information and boil it down to this, the net impact on extinction risk for different species and how that can actually go up and down and so on. But there's also one called the Biodiversity Intactness Index that comes out of Natural History Museum and predicts and so on. And there are others. So you can think about that, but nonetheless, you think about this idea of state of nature. On the other hand, we also need to understand the threats to nature. And so the other half of it would go under threat. So you say, okay, what's there? What's the stock? But what are the influences on that? I wish actually this was more like influences on or levers, because there are also positive opportunities around nature. There's not all threats, but still it goes under threats. And we do have a good understanding of the threats to biodiversity. The top ones are land and sea use change and extraction, which is actually direct harvesting of species. Go ahead.
Please feel free to delay further questions at the end if it's a bit of a tangent. But could you go back to the previous slide just for the image?
The data or the map kind of suggests a kind of the status quo and what would changes look like. But historically, a bunch of the kind of maybe, let's talk about Europe, let's say, huge amounts of diversity. It used to be a temperate rainforest, as far as I understand, and huge amounts of diversity within England itself. Like, is the opportunity cost of biodiversity also something we can think about, or is that like really dependent on data that we just don't have and maybe historical records?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, so yes, you would want to think about that, and you can think about a mix of protection, which is taking biodiversity that's there and trying not to lose it, but there's also restoration, which is trying to restore biodiversity that was lost historically. And you're absolutely right, a lot of the biodiversity was lost a very long time ago. Some of the species have gone permanently extinct, so we can't even put the species back. But even where the species haven't gone extinct, we're not sure what was there. And then we're also not sure how to put it back there, even if we are. So, for example, if you take agricultural land in Britain and you say stop farming it and you let it convert back to a woodland, you think great, right? And that, by the way, that is good for biodiversity. But that agricultural land has been soaked in fertilizers. We've lost a lot of the soil fungi. The topography's been evened out. So you'll end up with something different to what you began with. Yeah. So we kind of know that verbally. Like, no, I don't think anyone would disagree pretty much with what I just said. But the question, you're absolutely right. How then to do that quantitatively in a defensible kind of data-driven way? That's a huge challenge. Yeah, absolutely right. And so, yeah, when we think about, that's a good point actually. When we think about the state of nature today, we're primarily looking at the world as it is now. If we're looking at change, it's usually recent change. But one of the things we would like to do is to be able to understand much longer term changes, like since the deep past, and actually forecast much further into the future, when, for instance, climate could be quite different and so on. So that's a big challenge, how we expand that temporal dimension and so on. Yeah. So.
I guess maybe just last point, the richer countries are also the ones where potentially it might be easier to convert land back rather than poor countries where.
That's right, and also I think what you're hinting at there, which I completely agree with, is some of the socioeconomic inequalities. Right, it's very easy for us to sort of point at much poorer countries and say you need to Hey, there we go. So yes, anyway, so this idea then of threats to nature. So at the same time as understanding the state, we also want to understand, and again, I would think of the levers, the influences on nature, and especially land use change and direct harvesting of organisms. In the longer run, climate change is currently ranked 5th, but of course we're expecting it to become more important through time. And I think one way to think about this actually goes a little bit to what we were just saying, is you can think perhaps a bit of a hierarchy then for both of these halves, the state of nature and the threats to nature. So you can think about the current state, think about recent change. Some of the really interesting challenges are like understanding of recent change, actually. It's one thing to say what's been happening, but why? And then counterfactuals, so what would have happened? So let's say, there's been some pollution and that's reduced biodiversity. We can say that, are we sure that the biodiversity wouldn't have reduced anyway? So actually being really clear about counterfactual reasoning. And last but not least, forecasts. And we can think about forecasts under the BAU, business as usual, so where we think things are going. But perhaps more importantly, forecasts, conditional forecasts to say, if then, if we do this. And that's really the basis of policy, right? The future. So how do we go down that hierarchy? It's very, very challenging. And then also linking that to the ultimate drivers. And this is, I could have spoken a lot more about this. I'm not going to, especially given the time, because I will keep time. But imagine we knew everything I've just mentioned perfectly. So we understood where all the nature is, how it's changing, and why, and how it's going to change in the future. And we understand all the threat, we understand where all the mines are, and where all the deforestation's happening, and where all the land use change, and all the rest. Most of the policies, we need to actually link that into the human realm. So actually, which bits of government legislation can change that, which taxes could affect it, which companies actually own those mines, and so on. So if we really want to tackle these challenges, it's not all geographic in the end. We actually have to go into this kind of world of things like supply chains. And one thing I learned recently, which amazed me, is I was really naive about supply chains. So let's say you have a tanker that loads up some diesel somewhere, and then it travels across an ocean, and it docks somewhere else. On average, during that journey, that oil is traded 200 times between different organizations. I thought which is amazing. So actually then trying to work out when someone buys this product that arrives in some port, where it actually came from, it goes through 200 lines of reasoning. So, and it's not really geographic anymore. It's more things to do with economic flows or financial documents or legal things. So in a way, most of that data is not public, or is not public enough, or even if it is, it's too complex to make sense of. So there's a lot of sleuthery that we need to do in a sense at the moment to link what we're seeing, whether we're seeing it from space or we're seeing it on the ground, to these ultimate drivers. And it might be another use actually of LLMs. I think LLMs are one of the few technologies that might have the potential to be able to scrape all that data together and at least make the best understanding of it. Large language models, that is, again. So it's very complex. But in that space though, because once again, AI and scaled up deep learning, there's a lot of potential there. So what the scaled up deep learning really lets us do is deal with unprecedented volumes of data, unprecedented diversity of data. I think different modalities could be knitted together in much more easily. Things like remote sensing and satellites, these create enormous volumes of data, but using things like vision methods are able to now boil those down and do a lot more with them than we could before. Language, as I said, there's so much important knowledge that's in language form. Unprecedented model capacities as well. So these models are huge. So that means that they can kind of link data together and kind of uncover cause and effect relationships like never before. We can fine tune these models as well. So we can have sort of all-purpose models, but then we fine tune them for different purposes. So different countries or different, companies will be able to integrate their own data to then fine tune these models. And so on and so on. And the human interaction side, I think, is fascinating as well. Like, we shouldn't always think that we're automating everything here. Actually, we're looking to sort of augment and increase human productivity as well in these spaces. So a reminder then. Oh, go ahead.
Here we are. Thank you. Are LLMs suitable for this kind of geotemporal data, to capture the spatial and temporal patterns?
Yeah, there are some people thinking about that. That's right. So at the moment, most of the applications of deep learning in geo are using specialist geo methods, typically derived from vision type methods. We're typically dealing with gridded numbers and things like this. But you're absolutely right. One of the interesting things around LLMs has been the many different things that they can do, right? They don't just do sort of what we think of as language, they can do with tables and things like this, and formats and data structures and all that. So a lot of people are now thinking with the most recent generation of LLMs that they can do a lot more geographically. So yes, it's a huge space actually. A lot of people really interested in that, and I think there are just lots and lots of different opportunities in somehow linking together the world of LLMs and geo. You're absolutely right. So it's not just a separate thing. Like, you're not just going to do supply chains over here and vision methods for geo here. There'll also be a deeper connection between these. And one example of that is actually in the end, for example, most decision making and a lot of data comes in tabular form at the end of the day. So even if it's geographic, it might, for instance, be a list of data by county or by postcode or by zip code, as we say in the US, or by country and so on. So actually at that point, you actually are just dealing with tables, strings in tables a lot of the time, even if it's geographic. So we definitely want systems that can reason over sets of polygons, if you like, in that way. Yeah, so there's quite a lot there.
Tables are like 2D data, and LLMs are like sequence modeling. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And then people are working all these clever ways to do it, and it's evolving very quickly. But for example, LLMs deal with images. So you take an image and you tokenize the little subparts of the image, and then you just unwrap that into a serial representation of an image. It seems completely crazy, right? But actually, it works pretty well for basic images. So it's the same with tables. They're pretty good at doing that kind of stuff now. Yeah, and it's because this transformer architecture that means that they can kind of link together. So even if you you take a 2D thing and you unravel it into a 1D thing, the transformer architectures can basically sort of recover the underlying 2D structure. They're so incredibly flexible. And they've had lots of training doing that in the pre-training of the so-called foundational models. So you wouldn't be starting from scratch. You're starting from models that have seen millions of tables across the web. So they kind of understand like 2D tables and in the way, same for images. So. And by the way, I'm not an expert on LLMs, very much not, but that's my understanding. But certainly I think that the take-home point for someone like me has been the surprising flexibility and power of these LLMs to do things that we don't think of as language exactly. Yeah. Including things like programming and all the rest. I should probably really speed up now, right? Because I must be running out of time. So let's just say that, look, there's lots happening in this geomodeling space already. These are a couple of the organizations that are within the CCI that are creating the key biodiversity areas that I mentioned. We're also seeing private companies. This is one that I'm really interested in called Nature Alpha. I've been talking to them a lot. And they're a specialist company that takes lots of this biodiversity information and packages it for the financial sector. So they actually get this information onto the dashboards that investment companies are using to make investment decisions. So there's this growing ecosystem of these providers. Here's another one, Earth Genome, might be worth checking out. This is a large consortium, doing an amazing job of integrating together biodiversity information. And so then, this is a little bit more of a personal view then, like the things that I personally think are immediate opportunities now, and I think I'm very excited about this idea of species distribution modeling. It's just like modeling where the species are, and I think again we're capitalizing on the recent AI revolution. We can do joint species modeling where we actually model all the species together instead of one at a time. Hierarchical modeling where we bring in the phylogenetic relationships between them and so on. And on the right there, I've actually put in 3 really exciting papers, all of which have come out, I think, in the last couple of years. So this is moving really quickly now, so we're seeing people apply these. It's very, very exciting. And then onto the decision part, I'm going to have to really zip through this, but the take-home point here is that decision-making is really complex. It involves groups of stakeholders with multiple competing objectives. It tends to be iterative and interactive. It's not like you say, data, objective, decision. Actually, people go back and forth in groups to make decisions. You have to think about uncertainty and so on. And so, yes, that decision-making needs more information and evidence, but like I said, if we're not careful, then we just end up with information overload, and this is another big opportunity for AI. Things like LLMs could move towards something like an eco-assistant in the end. And there are established approaches, though, for thinking about decision-making. So, and this is an example of a book that you might want to look at. So there are principles and well-established ways of approaching complex decision-making in groups. So the question is, how can we accelerate that using data and models and AI and so on. So the recap then is this unprecedented demand for actionable biodiversity information. There's lots of data, information and orgs to build upon, but nonetheless there are major limitations in the current approaches. Things are like the gappiness and the uncertainties that we talked about. AI can help there, but it still needs to be part of this wider ecosystem of hardware, software, and socio-technical solutions, thinking about people. I suppose the question I wanted to put here, which I think is roughly what you think about, is what does this mean for planetary computation platforms and programming languages in particular? So again, I did say I was going to steer away from that. I've got a couple of slides here I was going to throw in, which is a little bit more technical, which is just to say, and this is supposed to be an open question. I honestly don't know, but it seems there's a question to me around, if we think about some of the fundamental kind of structures and schemas that we tend to think about in biodiversity, there's a limited number of these that seem overwhelmingly important. So one of them would be ecological geography. So we think about geographic space. So yes, that's things like sets of rasters, lines, polygons, and points, the classic stuff. But also as ecologists, we tend to think of things like ecoregions, DEM, digital elevation, so things like elevation, distance from the coast, ocean depth, wind and ocean currents that link things together, and things like migration paths of species and so on. So I suppose the question is, do we fit those things into more generic platforms, or do we somehow treat things like that as first-class citizens when we're thinking about platforms and programming languages? Like, could you have a DSL somehow that was really optimized around thinking about geography in the way that's needed for ecology and biodiversity? And then we can ask the same question for things like what I call ecological time. I think it's so easy to think of time as just a straight line, but to ecologists it really isn't, right? There are daily and lunar cycles that are nested within annual cycles. So in some ways, like right now is like closer to January 20 last year than it is to October in some ways, right? And yet in other ways it's not. So that's very much how I like to think about time. So again, how is time dealt with in these platforms? Is it a straight line, or is that somehow built in, this notion of nesting? Phylogenetic relationships between species, things like ecological traits, and then interactions between species. And I think, so it's not huge, it's like 5 kind of key things. I suppose the question is, would you kind of somehow build those in as special things into a platform, or would you somehow just use more generic approaches? And at the moment, of course, we use more generic approaches. I don't think we've ever really had databases or programming platforms that really treat these things as special. Go ahead.
Is the word you're looking for here ontology?
Yes, it probably is. I did a little bit of research around programming language fundamentals. I thought I'm not going to try and fake it, but yes, that's exactly right. I think it's exactly right. And I think that's all. So there we go. It was just saying, should we build those in, and if so, how? And with that, thanks for listening. Thanks.
Thank you, Drew.